Hi folks, I'm the Crazy Pigeon Lady. My name is Jem and it's my mission to entertain, educate and inspire people with all things pigeon and dove. Welcome back to my series, my beginner's guide to keeping pigeons as pets. I want to emphasise that this series is about keeping the domestic pigeon, the rock dove, Columba livia, although much of the advice that I give in this series is applicable to smaller dove species that are also kept as pets. In the previous episode, episode 2, I talked about how to choose and acquire the kind of pigeon that is right for you. And one of the things I talked about is getting yourself prepared for the arrival of your pigeon by having your accommodation set up in place. So in this episode, episode 3, I'm going to be talking about cage housing and equipment that you will need to have in place for the arrival of your pigeon. Also, for the purposes of this series, it's assumed that the majority of you want to keep your pigeons as pets indoors, inside your home. This series is not really designed for people who want to keep pigeons on a larger scale out of doors. You need to gather further information if that's something that you want to do. So, in summary, in this series, I'm going to be covering the basics of different types of cages and housing that you can choose into which to keep your pigeons, and also talk about cage linings that you can use inside your cages to keep them clean. I'm also going to cover the basics on perches and boxes, including any requirements for nesting if you're going to be keeping pairs of birds. I'm also going to talk about a little bit about basic feeding equipment that you'll need, although I'll probably talk about this in more detail in the next episode, episode 4, which will be all about feeding and nutrition. I'll also cover a few other useful general items that you'll need for your pet pigeon. So first of all, let's talk about the most important thing. What kind of cage or housing? And the first thing to think about is what kind of cage that you want to keep your bird in. And I see a lot of discussions online and a lot of questions raised about suitable types of cages and how big they should be. When it comes to indoors, you've got lots of different options because there are lots of pre-made, pre-designed cages out there that are designed for keeping animals indoors, whether those be birds or whether those be other different kinds of pets. So you will have a lot of choice and a lot of options there. Perhaps one of the biggest themes in the discussion about cagings is about size and what sort of size is an appropriate size to keep a pigeon. Now, first and foremost, I want to say here that pigeons are large birds. Unless you have small doves, a pigeon is quite a large bird, unlike other cage birds that might be kept like budgerigars or lovebirds or something quite small. Therefore, even the largest and most palatial and extravagant of indoor bird cages is not going to provide your pigeon with enough space to realistically fly around. And therefore, it's absolutely important that your pigeon, whatever size of cage it has, gets plenty of time outside of the cage to fly around, to fully stretch its wings, not only to provide it with exercise, but also because the environment of your home will be more stimulating. There'll be all different sorts of places, high and low, for your pigeon to explore. Also for social reasons, to allow the pigeons to socialise with each other and with you and other members of your household. And there will be lots of interesting objects and items around the house that your pigeons can interact with. And therefore, if you are allowing your birds lots and lots of time outside of the cage, then it's not actually that necessary and doesn't provide pigeons with a huge amount of additional benefit to have an enormous cage. And therefore, if your limitations on space or perhaps affordability require you to have a smaller cage for your pigeon, as long as you're providing them with plenty of space outside of the cage, then having a smaller cage is not so much of a problem. The most important thing when it comes to the size and type of cage is to remember that unlike hook-billed birds, pigeons can't climb. Therefore, a cage that is wide is more important than a cage that is tall, and that the cage needs to be wide enough for the pigeon to fully stretch its wings in at least one direction. Because when the pigeon is inside the cage and it's not outside exercising, they do from time to time like to stretch and extend their wings, and maybe even have an intense flap just to keep those wing muscles working. And therefore it's important that your cage is at least of a minimum size in order to allow them to do that. Also, your cage needs to be big enough to accommodate the food dishes and the perches and things like that without being too overcrowded. Also, if you have a pair of birds, it needs to be big enough to allow both birds to stretch as needed. And also, if they're going to be entering into any sort of breeding behaviour, you'll need space for there to be some kind of nest bowl or box or something for them to use to engage in that natural nesting behaviour. So, some of the considerations that you need to make when selecting a cage for your indoor pigeon is first and foremost to think about the size, and that's relevant to the number of birds, be it 1 or 2, and whether you want to keep them in the same cage, the sort of breed they are, how large, how active, and how much time you can give them outside of the cage. Also, the space that you have in your home as well, and it is important that you have sufficient space in order to be able to put the cage in a place that's going to be not knocked or subject to too many drafts or not on a surface that's unsafe. So you need sufficient space in order to put the cage in an appropriate place, and ideally that place should be where you spend most of your time, so that your pigeon can socialise with you day to day as part of the flock and get used to your normal daily routine. Also, wherever possible, you should site your pigeon cages where there is access to a window that you can open for ventilation, not necessarily when the birds are outside of the cage in case they might get outside, but certainly so that you can get free-flowing air. It's really important that birds get good ventilation, they have delicate respiratory systems, so it's good to get free-flowing air through wherever you can, and also to keep them in a room that's not damp or humid or gets a lot of steam. Also, it's not advisable to keep your cage in a kitchen where there might be fumes or smells or other things going on, some of which I'll talk about in a later episode on bird safety. Another thing you want to consider is the affordability, so how much you can afford. And cages can come in everything from, you know, a quite small cost and relatively inexpensive, all the way up to hundreds and hundreds of pounds or dollars or euros, as the case may be. So you need to select a cage that's not only appropriate for the bird and your environment, but also something that you can afford. Also, you need to think about how easy that cage is to maintain and clean as well. And make sure that it's something that's perhaps easy to deconstruct, the perches are easy to wash, or perhaps the trays are easy to clean, something that you can keep on top of relatively easily. I myself use extra large indoor rabbit and guinea pig cages for my birds. It's probably the smallest cage that I would use for a single adult pigeon of a medium to large breed. I wouldn't put more birds in there. My birds have lots of out of the cage time. Also, they're not particularly active as a breed. Therefore, they're quite content a lot of the time to actually sit inside their cage environment. One of the things I really like about these guinea pig and rabbit cages is that they have a nice deep plastic tray, which is great for catching all of the seed that they inevitably throw about when they eat. Also, they're long and wide, plenty of space for the birds to stretch their wings and exercise. One of my cages even comes with an internal platform with a compartment underneath, which is great to allow my hen to engage in that nesting behaviour. And they're very simple, easy to clean cage setups. A lot of people that keep pigeons, the dog crate is quite popular. Great thing about dog crates is that they come in a huge range of sizes, all the way from small dog all the way up to, you know, really huge cages for large dogs. And the fantastic thing about dog crates is they're inexpensive. They fold flat, which means they're easy to transport. They're pretty easy to clean, brushing down the bars and washing the trays. And also they're quite easily customizable as well. So you can add all sorts of different perches and shelves and create different levels inside them. So they're quite versatile in that way. And also if you want to travel with your bird, or perhaps take them to someone who's going to look after them while you go on holiday, then because they fold flat, it makes them much easier to transport. I actually have a small dog crate myself. I don't use it as a permanent cage. I use it as a hospital cage if I pick up the occasional rescue bird, or actually more often than not, I use it as a sun cage. So I'll put one of my birds inside and let them have some time outside in the garden on a nice sunny but not too hot day, so that they can go and do a little bit of sunbathing and relaxation. As well as indoor guinea pig or rabbit cages with nice deep trays, or the dog crates, you've also got the option of various types of parrot cages as well. And these tend to be cages which can go up to quite large sizes. They'll have multiple levels. Some of them even come on their own stands with casters or wheels, which is great. It allows you to move them around more easily, and these are all potential options for you. They will of course tend to be a bit more of the expensive side. So if you're looking for a cage that's simple and affordable, you're probably looking at something like the dog crate or the rabbit or the guinea pig cage. I guess the only criticism I would say of dog crates are that the trays are very thin and not particularly deep. And therefore lots of seed tends to get thrown out of the side of them, but you can modify them to put protection around the outsides to try and keep some of that food contained if your birds are a little bit messy when they eat. So moving on from cages then, and moving on to the internal structures, so perches and boxes, including things for nesting environments. It's likely that if you've bought a bird cage that it will come with some sort of appropriate perches, which may or may not necessarily be suited to pigeons. Again, the same principles apply to the outdoors, which is that any perches you provide need to be flat on the top. You need to make sure that they're sufficiently well spaced in the cage and the cage isn't too overcrowded so that the bird can move around, and again keep that space in order to be able to stretch out their wings. And again, if you have a pair of birds or even a particularly broody hen, some sort of little area that they can treat as a nesting area, perhaps some sort of box within the cage or some sort of suitable structure that's dark and snug, that they can get inside and engage in their normal nesting behaviour. You also need sufficient space in order to be able to keep the feeding and drinking equipment away from being underneath the perches, and this applies for both indoors and outdoors. Don't put your food or your water or anything underneath perches because they will get contaminated with poops from the birds sitting above. One of the things you can also consider for indoor or also even outdoor environments is providing a house brick as a potential perch. I love a house brick as a perch. They're fantastic for pigeons in the sense that they're quite weighty, so the pigeons aren't going to knock them over. They're rough surfaced, so they help keep the pigeons' claws down, so that you'll need to trim them less often. Also, they're really easy to keep clean as well. You know, just a scrubbing brush and a bit of dish soap and water, and they're very easy to clean. They dry very quickly. Pop them out of doors for 10 minutes or what have you, and they usually dry, especially on a nice sunny day. And I use these inside my indoor guinea pig and rabbit cages because they don't come with any perches, because they're not designed for birds. So this makes a great option. You could have a series of these also outdoors in your aviary, or even consider using them in any other kind of bird cage that you're using. Also need to consider the need of any disabled birds that you have too. So providing ramps to allow the birds to get from one level to another if they can't fly. Also, if your bird has vision difficulties or perhaps is even completely blind, you might need to provide some sort of padding around all or part of their cage just to ensure that they don't get any bumps or have any accidents while they're inside the cage. So I've talked quite a lot about cages there. Let's talk about cage lining. And the purpose of cage lining is to try and keep your cages clean and dry from poops or food or water or whatever else that might get spilled in the bottom of the cage. You've got lots of options here, and you don't even necessarily need to pick up any sort of specialist equipment either. Some of the considerations that you need to make, and this goes for outdoors as well as indoors, is how available is the material, how affordable it is for you, and also how sustainable it is as well. It might matter to you that how the material is actually disposed of. So indoors, you can think about a number of different options to meet your needs on affordability, sustainability, ease of acquisition or use. So here's some ideas for you. First of all, you could simply line the bottom of the cage with old towels. So here's an old towel. It's a bit old, it's a bit faded, but that's fine. It's perfect for pigeons. You could even consider lining the bottom of the cage with that. Great thing about old towels is that they're very absorbent, so they help to keep things dry. Also, as long as your bird's poops are healthy, they're very easily picked off the fabric if you're wearing gloves, and then you can put the towels through a hot wash 1 or 2 times a week, and they're relatively sustainable in that way. There's nothing to throw away, it's all reused. Another thing you can think about lining the bottom of your cage with is paper, newspaper. In this case, very cheap, might even be free. My family save all of the newspapers for me, so I get all of my newspapers for free. Not so good if your pigeon is unwell and perhaps their poop is quite mucky or liquid. You will have to change the paper quite often, but it's recyclable. It mulches down in landfills, so there's no problems with waste there. So this is something I use for my birds to line their cages. You could consider using something like puppy pads. Some people use puppy pads, especially if they've got a dog crate, because they'll come in appropriate sizes. Obviously, they're not. They don't necessarily decompose in landfills, so they're less sustainable than other options. But they are designed for the right thing, so that might be an appropriate choice for you. You could consider wood shavings, so something that you can get from a commercial chain pet store, for guinea pigs or rabbits or things like that. It is messier. A lot of it might come out of the cage. It'll certainly fill up your vacuum when you're cleaning, so it's certainly less ideal than other options, but it is certainly something you can consider. Finally, another option you can think about is using sand, and I did use sand for quite a while, bird sand. This is available from pet stores, so sacks of sand specifically for birds. If you can't get pet sand specifically for birds, use sand that's been designed for children's play sand pits, so it's gone through a cleaning process. Certainly don't go and dig up a bucket of sand from your local beach. The great thing about sand is that when the poops land on it, they dry out quite quickly, so it's relatively easy 1 or 2 times a day to pick the poops out of the sand with something like an old spoon or something like that. Also, you can rake the sand over. You can even put it through a metal sieve, not your kitchen sieve that you use for baking, one that you set aside specifically for your birds. And it means that you can reuse the sand a number of times before it will need changing. and therefore it's quite economical in that sense. Also because it's exfoliating, it will work on your bird's feet and help keep the bottom of their feet nice and clean, and quite soft too. Downsides of sand is that you need to think about how you're going to dispose of it, and you might not be able to do that in the household waste. Also, it can get a little bit mucky if your bird is sick, and their poops are quite liquid, so you might want to consider using a different cage lining in that sort of circumstances. Also, when it comes to washing the bottom of the cage, you absolutely can't do it in your bath or your sink. The sand will clog up your pipes, therefore you do need an appropriate outdoor environment in which to wash that cage down. And you will need a cage that has a deep tray as well. So sand works quite well for something like the guinea pig or the rabbit cage. Not so good if the cage that you're using doesn't have a particularly deep tray, something like the dog crate. So feeding equipment, let's move on to feeding equipment. So I've talked about cages, I've talked about cage lining, so let's talk about feeding equipment. There's lots and lots of different options here, and in fact you don't even need any specialist equipment. Quite a lot of normal household objects will do. When it comes to feeding and water containers, it's important to remember to have something that's deep. So when pigeons drink, they drink by drafting, so they need to have their heads down, something that they can put their beak into. So something like a ceramic dish or bowl of a suitable depth. Similarly for the food as well, again, a nice deep dish, something that will try to contain as much of the food as possible, as pigeons do have a habit of flicking it about. And you'll also need a dish for them to take grip as well. I don't use any specialist dishes. I've got this, so I use these. These are ramekins, so small round baking dishes for baking your souffles or your desserts and things like this. Great thing I like about these is that they're nice and deep. They've got some weight to them, so they don't flip over. They're great for water or for food, as appropriate. I also use some slightly smaller dishes. So these came in pre-packaged desserts that I bought from the supermarket, and I saved these ceramic dishes. Not so good for water, they're a bit small, but great for food and great for grit as well. And the fantastic thing about ceramic dishes is they're easy to clean, easy to wash. I can bung them in the dishwasher. You know, you can have a couple of sets, you know, one clean and one to wash, so they're very easy to manage. You can also get ceramic dishes from pet shops as well that are designed for pet food, or you could even use stainless steel dishes as well. Another thing you can consider for feeding greens and things like that is getting yourself something like a peg, or something like maybe a hair clamp, or even like a bulldog clip, so that you could take a bunch of salad leaves and you can clip them to the bars of the cage, so that your birds can peck or pull at the salad greens, and it's a useful way to attach that food to the bars of the cage, so you don't have to hold it for them. So in episode 5, I'll be talking about cleaning and hygiene. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail now about what sort of equipment that you'll need, because I'll cover it in that episode. So I've talked about cages, perches, cage linings and feeding equipment. And the last thing I'm going to talk about today is just other general items that you'll need for your pet pigeon. So first of all, is some sort of carry box or pet carrier. Now certainly you'll need one of these when you go and pick up your pigeon for the first time, but also you'll need it for taking them for trips to the vet, either if they're sick or just for general checkups, or if you're taking your bird traveling with you, or perhaps taking them to a friend to stay with them while you're on holiday. There are lots of commercially available pet carriers out there. maybe designed for cats or small animals, but perfectly appropriate for pigeons. Always make sure that you line them with a towel or something like that, not only to keep the bottom of the box clean, but also something for the bird to grip onto that will just make them feel that little bit more safe and secure. I myself actually use cardboard pet carriers, so I've got a couple in 2 different sizes. So I have this one. I have this one here. So this is a fairly largish one. So this will fit 1 large pigeon in quite happily. I always put a towel in the bottom. I like cardboard boxes because they fold flat for storage, which is something that a plastic pet carrier wouldn't. And also when a little bit battered, then they can be disposed of and recycled. I also have a smaller version of the carry box too. This one is actually specifically designed for pigeons. So it's much more snug. I got this one because the larger box, the bird can kind of sway or rock around in it, and birds do suffer from travel sickness occasionally. So sometimes a snugger, tighter box where they can't sway around too much is actually more comfortable and less likely to make them feel sick. These boxes are a little bit smaller, therefore if you have a large bird, this is going to be a tight fit, so it's more better for an average size bird too. Other things you'll need is potentially a folding or travel cage. I mentioned earlier that I've got the dog crate, so if when I go and take my birds to a friend to stay with for holiday, I use the folding cage as well. I also use it as a sun cage. It's a good thing to have around, even if you don't use it as your main cage. Another thing you should perhaps consider is a set of kitchen scales. You've probably got one of these around your house already. It's an important part of monitoring your bird's health to actually weigh them on a regular basis, and therefore you can stand them on your kitchen scales and just make sure that you're monitoring and recording their weight, and it's a good way of keeping an eye on them. Always make sure you clean and sanitize your scales after weighing your birds, before using them to weigh out any food. You should also have clippers. This is to clip your bird's claws. Now these clippers that I've got are specifically pet nail clippers, so they are specifically for the purpose. Human nail clippers would also work as well, particularly the larger, stronger ones designed for toenails rather than fingernails. And as long as you know how to cut nails properly, and I'll talk about that in a later episode, then either will work. What I also like to have alongside the clippers is a little emery board as well. And again, this is not for pets. This is for human fingernails. Sometimes the nails just need softening off at the end. They don't need so much of a trim. They just need a little bit of a file down. So sometimes using an abrasive emery board will get you a better result than trying to clip the claws. So that's a good thing to have around. And again, that's a normal human emery board. That's not a specialist pet product. The other thing I suggest you have is a measuring jug. Again, you can use your kitchen measuring jug, which I'm sure lots of you will have kicking around. Some supplements, particularly for water, will require you to use a certain amount per quantity of water. So it's good to have a measuring jug around in order to make sure that you're measuring out those quantities correctly for the amount of water that you're using. Finally, a large deep bowl or tray that you can use as a bird bath. So it's really important that pigeons get regular baths. This is good for their feathers. It's especially good for breeding birds as well. They need to keep their underside of their feathers moist in order to transfer them to the eggs. You can use something like a cat litter tray. I use a large ceramic fruit bowl. It's only designed for one bird at a time, but you can get a larger tray or pan if you've got multiple birds, if they're willing to share. So it doesn't have to be a specialist piece of equipment, just something that you can fill with a couple of inches of water, something that that's heavy enough that if once it's filled with water and your bird is perching on the side, that it's not going to flip up or flip over. Alternatively, if your bird doesn't like sitting in water, you could get a spray bottle and just spritz them with water, or an indoor living bird might be perfectly happy to go inside your shower. That was a lot to go through there. I hope that's been useful to you. In the next episode, episode 4, I'm going to be talking about feeding and nutrition for your birds, so please do stay tuned for that. And if you found this helpful, please give this video a like, please subscribe to my channel, and share this video with anyone that you think might benefit from it. So I've been Jem, the Crazy Pigeon Lady, and I look forward to seeing you again in a future episode. Bye bye.